It started with flashing red and blue lights. A routine stop, or so they said. Two officers stepped out, their hands resting on their belts, their eyes scanning her like she was already guilty. She had done nothing wrong. But in that moment, she knew exactly what this was. The questions came sharp, the tone sharper. Then, without warning, they pulled her from the car, handcuffed her, and shoved her into the back of the cruiser. She asked for an explanation. They smirked. She said nothing more, because in her mind, she was already picturing the look on their faces when they'd see her again, not as a suspect, but as the judge. Her name was Danielle Carter, 38 years old, sharp-minded and unshakably calm under pressure, a Harvard Law graduate, former public defender, and now one of the youngest judges in the state's history. Danielle didn't flaunt her position. She believed respect was earned, not demanded. But in the courtroom, her presence commanded attention. Outside those walls, however, she was just another black woman in America. It was a warm Thursday evening when she left the courthouse. She had spent the day presiding over a tense criminal case, one that had stretched her patience thin. All she wanted was to get home, change into something comfortable, and enjoy dinner with her daughter. The streets were calm, the golden light of sunset spilling between the buildings as she drove through her neighborhood, a quiet, middle-class area where she knew most of the faces. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat, a text from her daughter. "Can we have tacos tonight, please?" She smiled, but just as she slowed for a stop sign, she noticed movement in her rearview mirror. A patrol car. No siren, no lights, just following. She made the turn toward her street. The car followed. Her chest tightened. She told herself not to assume the worst. She had done nothing wrong. Her license and registration were up to date. Then the flash of red and blue. Her stomach dropped. Danielle pulled over to the curb, rolled down her window, and placed her hands clearly on the steering wheel, a habit she'd adopted long ago, one that spoke to the reality of her world. Survival first. Explanations later. Two officers emerged, both male. One, tall and broad-shouldered, rested his hand near his holster. The other, younger and weary, carried a smirk that seemed to say he had already made up his mind about her. "Evening, ma'am," the older one said, though his tone held no warmth. "License and registration." She handed them over without a word. The younger officer leaned in, peering into her back seat as if expecting to find something. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" "I'm on my way home," she replied evenly. He chuckled under his breath. "Home, huh?" It was subtle, but she heard the implication, and she knew exactly where this was going. Danielle kept her tone even, her face unreadable, a skill she had perfected over years in the courtroom. She had faced armed defendants, hostile lawyers, and jury members with thinly veiled prejudice. But something about this moment, the way the younger officer's eyes swept over her, felt different. It wasn't just suspicion, it was contempt. The older officer glanced at her license, then at her. "This your car?" "Yes," she said. "You sure? It's a pretty nice ride." She gave a slow nod, resisting the urge to roll her eyes. He looked at the younger one. "Run it." The younger officer walked back to the cruiser, but not before leaning in just close enough to mutter, "Don't go anywhere." Danielle sat still. The street was quiet except for the hum of the police radio from their vehicle. Her mind flashed to her daughter, waiting at home for tacos, probably pacing near the window wondering why dinner was late. Minutes dragged. The older officer returned, but instead of handing back her license, he motioned toward the curb. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Her pulse quickened. "Officer, may I ask why out of the vehicle?" His tone was sharper this time. She complied, stepping out slowly, hands visible. Years of legal training told her, don't escalate, don't give them a reason. But the younger officer had already circled around, his hand now resting fully on his holster. "Turn around," he said. "For what?" she asked, still calm. "Turn around." Before she could react, he grabbed her wrist and yanked it behind her back. Pain shot up her arm. "Hey!" The metal of the cuffs bit into her skin. "Am I under arrest?" she demanded. "Sure are." The older one said flatly. She searched his eyes. On what charge? Suspicion of driving a stolen vehicle. Her breath caught. A stolen vehicle. Her vehicle. Registered in her name. Paid for with her own hard-earned money. Danielle felt the cold metal tighten. She knew this wasn't about a car. It wasn't about suspicion. This was about the uniform they wore. And the color of her skin. They didn't read her rights. They didn't tell her where they were taking her. They shoved her into the back of the patrol car like a common criminal. As the car pulled away, Danielle looked out the window at the street she had driven down countless times before. The houses were the same. The people were the same. But tonight, everything felt different because now she was being paraded through it in handcuffs. Her phone buzzed in her purse, still on the passenger seat of her car, now locked up and being towed. She thought of her daughter again. Would she be scared? Would she think her mother had done something wrong? The ride to the station was silent, except for the occasional burst of static from the police radio. Danielle's mind shifted from disbelief to resolve. She knew these officers didn't recognize her. They saw a black woman, nothing more. They didn't know the years she had spent fighting for justice, the nights she had stayed late in the courthouse, drafting rulings that would change lives, and they definitely didn't know that tomorrow she would be the one deciding their fate. Danielle didn't sleep that night. The cell they'd placed her in was small, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, making it impossible to rest. She sat on the hard bench, replaying the arrest over and over, the sting of the handcuffs still fresh in her wrists. No charges had been filed. No phone call granted. Hours passed in silence except for the occasional clang of the barred door as officers walked past without looking in. When they finally released her at dawn, it was without apology, without explanation. They handed back her purse and keys like she'd been an inconvenience, not a citizen whose rights they'd trampled. She drove home in the same car they'd accused her of stealing, the steering wheel trembling in her hands. At home, her daughter ran into her arms, asking where she'd been. Danielle just hugged her tighter. She couldn't explain. Not yet, because in just a few hours, she would be in court. On the bench, wearing the robe. Bym, she was seated in her chambers reviewing the docket. She sipped her coffee, scanning the morning's cases, and there it was, 2 officers, a civil rights complaint. Their names jumped off the page. It was them. She closed the file slowly, steadying her breathing. This was not about revenge. This was about justice. But justice had a way of making itself felt. When the courtroom filled, Danielle stepped out from behind the curtain. The chatter died instantly as she took her place at the bench, and there they were, the older officer shifting uncomfortably in his seat, the younger one glancing around like he was looking for an escape. They recognized her instantly. The younger one's jaw tightened, eyes darting to the floor. The older one tried to maintain his composure, but his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. Danielle adjusted her glasses and spoke into the microphone. Court is now in session. Her voice was steady, every syllable deliberate. She called the case. The plaintiff, a local man, alleged unlawful detention, excessive force, and racial profiling. The defendants, the 2 officers who had cuffed her less than 12 hours ago. Every word in the file read like her own experience. The same arrogance, the same disregard for rights. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. Danielle let the lawyers speak, but she watched the officers the whole time. Watched the way they avoided her gaze. Watched a sweat bead at their temples. When it was her turn to address the room, she leaned forward, hands clasped. This court is not blind to the fact that the law is meant to protect every citizen equally, she began. And yet, too often, it is used as a weapon against those who have done nothing wrong except exist while black. The younger officer shifted in his chair. She didn't tell the courtroom what had happened to her. That wasn't necessary. What mattered was the record, the testimony, the truth. But her presence, her robe, her authority said what words never could. By the time the hearing ended, the officers knew this wasn't just another case. This was a reckoning, and it had only just begun. As she struck the gavel, Danielle felt the room vibrate with a new kind of silence, the kind that comes when those in power realize they are no longer untouchable. When the hearing ended, Danielle didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't even look back at the officers as they left. This wasn't about her victory, it was about something bigger. Something older than her, older than those men, older than that courtroom. That night, she sat in her living room, still in her robe, the TV muted in the background. Her daughter played on the floor, humming a tune, blissfully unaware of how close her mother had come to not being there at all. Danielle thought about the split-second decisions those officers had made. The snap judgment, the profiling, the certainty in their voices when they accused her of a crime she hadn't committed. And she thought about what would have happened if she wasn't a judge. If she didn't have the connections, the resources, the platform to push back. She knew the answer because she'd seen it happen to others. Careers destroyed, records tainted, families shattered. The robe had protected her in the end. But it shouldn't take a robe to be safe in your own country. In the days that followed, Danielle found herself telling the story quietly, first to her closest friends, then to fellow judges, and eventually to a group of young law students she was mentoring. The room went still as she described the feeling of those handcuffs, the humiliation of being treated as guilty before she could speak, the cold calculation of realizing she was just another target in someone's pattern of abuse. One of the students asked, "But Judge, how can this still happen?" Danielle paused, weighing her words. "It still happens," she said slowly, "because the system wasn't built to protect everyone equally. And the people who benefit from that imbalance rarely give it up willingly." Her own case was still unfolding. The complaint from the plaintiff was gathering attention. News outlets had begun circling. Civil rights groups were asking questions. But for every story that got airtime, Danielle knew there were hundreds that didn't. That's the part most people don't see, the quiet, everyday moments where injustice slides by unnoticed. The unreported stops, the unchallenged assumptions, the countless people who go home each night carrying the weight of something they can't prove but will never forget. Weeks later, Danielle walked into her courtroom again, and for a moment, she saw it differently. Not just as a place where cases were decided, but as a battlefield where the fight for fairness was waged every single day. She knew she couldn't erase what had happened to her, but she could use it. And so she did. She pushed for bias training programs in her district. She worked with local advocacy groups to document unlawful stops and demand accountability. She met with other judges to address racial disparities in sentencing and policing, because the truth is, racism isn't always loud. It's not always a slur shouted on the street or a cross burning in the night. Sometimes it's quiet paperwork, a routine traffic stop, a shrug from someone in power who should have done better. And that's why this story matters. Because Danielle's wasn't just a personal incident, it was a mirror, a reflection of what too many still face. So, I'll leave you with this. If a judge in her own community can be handcuffed, humiliated, and accused without cause, what does that say about the rest of us? And more importantly, how many more times will this happen before we stop calling it a mistake and start calling it what it is? If this story moved you, don't just let it fade when the video ends. Share it. Talk about it. Challenge the moments where you see injustice, whether it's on the street, in your workplace, or in your own family, because silence doesn't protect the victim. It protects the system.